famous rocker is part of an investigation by a task force that looks into internet crimes against children. Authorities searched Gene Simmons' house in Benedict Canyon.
The latest about Gene Simmons is breaking the headlines, and it's not the kind of story fans expected. For decades, he was the fire-breathing face of Kiss, a rock legend who turned shock into fame and fame into fortune.
Gene Simmons, the rock star, has been entertaining fans for years. Loyal fans who have followed Kiss for decades. They are known as the Kiss Army.
But behind the makeup and bravado, new revelations are stirring questions about his family, his empire, and the choices catching up to him now. Is it scandal, redemption, or something that blurs the line between the two? One thing is certain. The news is louder than the music, and the truth is still unfolding. From Haifa to the Demon. Before Gene Simmons became the Demon, breathing fire on stage and spitting blood to roaring stadiums, he was just Chaim Witz, a boy from Haifa, Israel, raised by a single mother who had survived one of the darkest chapters in human history.
I was born in Israel, and I didn't know anything about history or life or anything. It's just that I knew that my mother was there, our father, my father. See, even I didn't want to personalize.
His beginnings weren't glamorous. They were marked by scarcity, trauma, and an unrelenting desire never to feel powerless again. That drive would shape the persona he later created, one that became as much armor as it was entertainment. Simmons entered the world in a home still shadowed by the Holocaust. His mother, Flora Klein, had survived the concentration camps in Hungary, losing family members to the Nazis before managing to escape and rebuild in Israel. She carried that trauma with her, and while she didn't speak often about what she had endured, her silence and overprotectiveness spoke volumes. Chaim grew up in an environment where survival was not an abstract concept, but a daily lesson. By the mid-1950s, his parents had separated. His father stayed behind in Israel while Flora raised Chaim alone, working long hours in factories. At times, their meals consisted only of bread and milk. The boy who would one day command arenas was, in those years, just another hungry child finding ways to get by. He even made his own winter coat from an army blanket, an image far from the leather-clad rock god he would later become. But hardship has a way of forging ambition. Chaim escaped through comic books, particularly American imports like Spider-Man and Superman. Even before he could read English, he studied the panels, teaching himself the language word by word because he was determined to understand his heroes. By 7, he spoke Hebrew, Hungarian, Turkish, and was beginning to piece together English. It wasn't just about words, it was about transformation. If his heroes could mask their pain behind costumes and larger-than-life powers, maybe he could too. Flora made a life-changing decision in 1958. She and Chaim emigrated to Queens, New York, with nothing but a clean break, family, no clear path ahead, and zero money in hand. It was a culture shock. Toilets that flush amazed him, as well as TV dinners. But school was ruthless, and his accent made him a target again as the outcast. Instead, he would think of how he was going to make his mark. So he kept going. He sold cactus plants door to door, picked fruit, and learned English through TV and comics. Every rejection only made him stronger. In his early teens, Chaim was already walking in a new pair of shoes. Legally changing his name to Gene Klein, he took Gene from the moniker of cowboy stars like Gene Autry, making it Gene Simmons, which sounded more rock star-like. He played guitar for hours upon hours, hung out in small bands, and studied pop culture, with barely enough discipline as played out in classroom studies. The Beatles' performance in 1964 on The Ed Sullivan Show set his soul on fire. It wasn't just fame he wanted to admire, It was the kind he wanted to claim for himself. These odd jobs, where he worked at butcher shops, delis, and later as a teacher in Spanish Harlem, were all things Simmons did to save money while secretly plotting his true career. No drinking, no illegal substances. He kept his eyes open and watched as others fell off. His crystal-clear vision merged into his personality. Always poised, always calculated. When Simmons began working with Paul Stanley to hammer out the basics of Kiss, those early teachings found full expression. He wouldn't settle for being just another musician. He wanted to be a legend, untouchable, larger than life. To this end, he created The Demon, an alter ego with horror film roots, comic book villain influences, and shadows of his own childhood. The painted face, the blood, the fire-breathing, all were more than theatrics. They were a shield and a statement that he would never again be that powerless little boy from Haifa. That armor didn't just protect him. It became the foundation for a business empire built on shock, spectacle, and strategy. The Kiss Empire. When Gene Simmons and Paul Stanley formed Kiss in the early 1970s, their goal wasn't just to play music. They wanted to build a spectacle, a force that would grab attention before a single note was played. And Simmons, always the strategist, quickly realized that music could be only half the business. The other half? Image, branding, and turning KISS into a product that fans could take home. The foundation was the look. With Ace Frehley painting himself as the spaceman, Peter Criss as the Catman, Paul Stanley as the Star Child, and Simmons transforming into the Demon, the band's identity became instantly recognizable. In an era where rock bands often blurred together, Kiss stood out like a comic book come to life. Simmons saw the potential not just in sound, but in licensing. If kids could wear the same faces they saw on stage, Kiss could become more than a band. It could be a brand. The plan worked. By 1975, even before they had their first major radio hit, Kiss had launched into merchandising. Lunchboxes, trading cards, dolls, posters, and belt buckles rolled out. It was unlike anything the rock world had seen. Parents who hated the music found themselves buying toys with the KISS logo because their kids demanded it. Within a few years, the band's merchandise was generating millions, sometimes even outpacing record sales. The tipping point came with the release of the live album Alive in 1975. It captured the chaos and spectacle of their concerts and became their commercial breakthrough, selling millions of copies. Suddenly, Kiss wasn't just a cult act. They were headlining arenas, selling out shows, and fueling a fan base known as the Kiss Army. Simmons understood what this meant. Loyalty could be monetized, not just through ticket sales, but through everything surrounding the experience. By the end of the 1970s, Kiss had launched more than 100 licensed products, including Kiss-branded pinball machines, Halloween costumes, and even board games. Simmons pushed boundaries with ideas most bands would laugh at. Think Kiss-branded coffins decades later. You were shamelessly simple. 10 people wanted to buy it. Kiss would put their name on it. Critics called it shameless, but Simmons said it was just good business. Why limit the reach of the band to vinyl and tours when it could extend into every corner of pop culture? The unyielding pursuit of profit always had its consequences. By the late 70s, the band spread all over, but some fans and critics said that the music seemed shoved into the shadow of the marketing blitz. In 1978, the TV movie Kiss Meets the Phantom of the Park only added bricks to the backlash. With such wooden acting and an absurd plot, it was dismissed by many as one gimmick too far. For Simmons, though, it was proof of concept. Kiss was no longer a rock band. but rather an empire into which it could march further into television, film, and beyond. In the decades since, Simmons has honed in on this vision. By the early 2000s, Kiss trademarked its logo on over 5,000 items from different categories, including condoms and credit cards. By this time, Kiss had already crossed over the billion-dollar mark in merchandise revenues. So, as purists decried him as a sellout, Simmons brushed it off, often saying, "Being called a sellout means somebody's buying," a line that summed up his unapologetic stance. This obsession with branding has made KISS a pioneer in creating music as a franchise. Simmons has followed how comic books, superheroes, and movies have built brand loyalty through characters and merchandise. He did the same in a rock and roll approach. Every tour becomes a circus, not just a concert, but has a new merch drop and a new earning. That formula was ruthless, but it worked. Few bands from the 1970s can still parlay into packed choirs in the 2020s. Kiss can, and its durability endures not just because of its music, but also the relentless drive of Simmons to keep that brand alive. He did not just build a band, but an economy. But behind the blood-spitting businessman was a man who had to reconcile that empire with his private life, one that fans would eventually see on camera. Love, family, and reality TV rewrites. For decades, Gene Simmons cultivated an image of the untouchable rock god, the demon who breathed fire, spat blood, and claimed thousands of lovers. Marriage, family, and domestic life seemed like the opposite of everything he stood for. And yet, the man who once bragged about never settling down eventually found himself at the center of a reality TV show, his personal life exposed for millions to dissect. It all began with Shannon Tweed. The two met in 1983 at the Playboy Mansion, where Simmons's reputation preceded him. Shannon was no stranger to the spotlight herself. As a former Playboy Playmate of the Year and rising actress, she knew how the Hollywood game worked. Still, their relationship surprised many. Gene was open about his refusal to marry, citing his parents' divorce and his distrust of permanence. Shannon, however, was patient, though that patience would be tested repeatedly across nearly 3 decades. Through the late 1980s and 1990s, Shannon and Gene built a family together. Their son, Nick, was born in 1989, followed by their daughter, Sophie, in 1992. Despite his refusal to put a ring on Shannon's finger, Gene embraced fatherhood in his own unconventional way. He remained proud of being sober, never touching illegal substances or alcohol, and pointed to that as his saving grace. For all his rock star excesses with women, he claimed he wanted to be present for his children. But the contradictions in Gene's life became impossible to ignore when Gene Simmons' Family Jewels premiered on A&E in 2006. For the first time, fans and critics alike saw the demon stripped of his armor. The show chronicled his home life with Shannon, Nick, and Sophie, portraying a man who balanced rock tours with school events, business deals with family dinners. On one hand, it softened his image, making him more relatable to mainstream audiences. On the other hand, it peeled back layers of dysfunction that had long been hidden behind stage makeup. From the start, and over 7 years later, the show encompasses live drama from the birth of Episode 1 to the end of Episode 160 of Season 7. And from the production house to the audience, it was a ratings smash hit. Viewers tuned in to watch Gene watching Shannon bicker about his commitment issues, impart love and responsibility wisdom to his children, and wrestle with the burden of son and a global icon. But, in a rather humorous way, the show was perhaps serving to show the cracks Gene had spent years trying to paper over. The most dramatic moments came in the story in the latter seasons, with Shannon boiling over into rage. She had tolerated decades of infidelities and gazes evasively about marriage. But the breaking point came in 2011. In a notorious scene, Shannon left the set during a talk show appearance, labeling Gene a pig. Another unforgettable moment was when Shannon discovered the infamous Polaroids, thousands of photographs allegedly cataloging his indecent rendezvous with women through the years. She burned the Polaroid photos in front of the cameras as a show of rage, which symbolically erased a section of his past that had haunted their relationship. And then Gene proposed a twist in fate, up to then being believed impossible. In July 2011, Gene popped the question to Shannon after nearly 28 years of relationship. Come October, his kids Nick and Sophie stood by his side, Nick as best man and Sophie as maid of honor, when the wedding took place. Although a private redemption, the wedding ended up being a public spectacle. Critics have called it a publicity stunt, but to many fans, it was a rare glimpse of emotional vulnerability from a man who spent years avoiding any commitment. The man, it turns out, was finally able to admit that much of his fear was rooted in childhood scars and a lifetime's deflection. Reality TV, then, reinvented Gene Simmons's public narrative. For television audiences, he was transformed from the demon of Kiss to the flawed partner, the sometimes awkward father, the man who is trying, rather late in life, to balance ego with love. The show was both a test and a platform for Shannon, Nick, and Sophie, while for Gene, it was a rewriting of his image, one he could not fully control. And while the cameras eventually turned off in 2012, the echoes of Family Jewels remain. It revealed Gene Simmons not as a monster, but as a man caught between myth and reality. Yet even with his softer side exposed, controversy was never far behind, reminding the world that the demon's shadow could still cause chaos. When fame bites back. For most of his career, Gene Simmons thrived on controversy. He leaned into the villain role, the demon, the egotistical businessman, the unapologetic womanizer. In the 1970s, it worked. Headlines about his excess only fueled the mystique of Kiss. But by the 2000s, culture had shifted. What once looked like rock and roll bravado was now being scrutinized under a harsher light. Simmons, never one to hold back, found himself facing lawsuits, scandals, and PR nightmares that chipped away at the empire he'd built. One of the earliest flashpoints came in 2010 when ESPN makeup artist Victoria Jackson accused Simmons of inappropriate behavior during a Sports Center appearance. She claimed he hugged and pressed against her while in costume. Simmons dismissed the charge as absurd, even filing a countersuit that argued his metal codpiece made such contact impossible. The case was quietly settled, but it set the tone. His brand of shock no longer played the same way off stage. In the years that followed, more allegations surfaced. In 2016, a dishwasher at one of his Rock and Brews restaurants accused him of groping her. A similar claim came in 2017. Both cases were resolved privately, but they suggested a pattern Simmons had long shrugged off as misunderstandings. He insisted people were misinterpreting his humor or twisting his blunt personality into misconduct. Still, the lawsuits left behind smoke, even when no fire was proven. PR disasters weren't confined to the courtroom. Simmons's unfiltered mouth often landed him in trouble. In 2017, he tried to trademark the famous devil horns hand gesture, insisting he invented it in 1974. The move outraged the metal community. Fans pointed out that John Lennon and Ronnie James Dio had used it decades earlier. Simmons withdrew the filing within days, but the damage stuck. He looked greedy, tone-deaf, desperate to monetize even a cultural symbol. Fox News, which became notorious that same year, banned Simmons for barging into meetings, pulling his pants down to show off his scars, and making some really bad and crude jokes regarding Michael Jackson while he was there promoting some new Kiss project. In just a couple of hours thereafter, Fox declared him lifetime banned. This time, antics overshadowed the empire once again. Without lawsuits, Simmons was bound for the wrong while giving away the headlines in any year. In 2024, while a guest on the Dancing with the Stars show, he made comments regarding female dancers that viewers perceived as creepy. No discussion on choreography. All was on how they looked, jokingly that one contestant had fogged up my glasses. Social media erupted, naming him the gross uncle of rock. Rather than apologize, Simmons doubled down in interviews, insisting he stood by his words. What once came off as blunt honesty now simply reads as stubborn defiance. The unsuccessful PR affairs, litigation, and out-of-the-blue utterances set a common pattern. Confrontation was Simmons's mode instead of contrition. They are after him for saying what most won't voice. But even die-hard fans eventually began to voice doubt about whether that very persona was an asset in today's world. But Simmons still demonstrated resilience. Every firestorm, however, dented his reputation. Kiss merchandise continues to sell. Solo performances still sell out the arenas, its reality television and interviews. Yet the shadow of controversies is a reminder that fame isn't just a spotlight. It can burn. For Gene Simmons, the very arrogance that once made him untouchable soon turned out to be his biggest flaw. Fame made him a millionaire many times over, but as headlines turned hostile, so did reminders to the world, and, soon enough, even Simmons himself, that even the demon could bleed. And in recent years, those wounds and missteps have only deepened, sparking debates about whether his legend is still under his control or if it's spiraling away from him. The flashpoints. Everyone's arguing about. Even after 50 years in the spotlight, Gene Simmons shows no sign of slowing down or dodging controversy. The years 2024 and 2025 have been especially volatile, reigniting debates about his ego, his judgment, and whether the man behind the demon still knows when to step aside. The first flashpoint came in October 2024 on Dancing with the Stars. Fans expected cheeky banter, but instead, Simmons made personal remarks about female contestants, quipping that one dancer had fogged up his glasses. Social media exploded, branding him the creepy uncle of rock. What might have slid decades earlier now hits differently. Rather than apologize, Simmons doubled down, insisting he stood by every word. Supporters praised his bluntness. Critics saw him as out of touch. If October tested his commentary, April 2025 tested his business instincts. Simmons unveiled the ultimate Gene Simmons experience, a $12,495 fan package before tickets. Buyers could roadie for a day, help with sound check, eat backstage, receive a signed bass, and be introduced on stage. Critics slammed it as shameless profiteering during hard economic times, with blogs dubbing it the most tone-deaf package in rock. Fans debated whether it was exploitation or pure rock capitalism. The packages are still sold out, with some attendees calling it priceless. The divide between devotion and outrage grew sharper. That title brought perhaps the most polarizing of all. Simmons and Kiss receiving Kennedy Center honors from President Donald Trump in August 2025. It blew fans away, particularly those who remembered Simmons's sharp comments after January 6th. when he compared Trump's rise to cockroaches crawling from walls. The award seemed hypocritical, taking it from Trump, and the social media was flooded by memes comparing past criticisms with that shining photo op. Simmons chose not to comment and let silence do the talking. But silence only served to fuel speculations that his business outweighed convictions. The year also peeled the few cracks in his solo career. Several shows were canceled in March 2025, owing to ticket sales coming in less than expected. Taking over premium seats of more than $500, critics said fans had reached the limit. For them, the cancellations marked the beginning of the end, proof that Simmons's reputation for squeezing his brand had finally outlived fan loyalty. Simmons shrugged off the accusation, saying that old-fashioned shows were easier without a full Kiss setup. His confidence or arrogance just sparked more debate. However, every occasion was not a matter of spectacle. It was here that Simmons broke down into tears in embarrassment while being interviewed by CBS Mornings in July 2025, just after the death of Ozzy Osbourne. Simmons remembered Kiss opening for Black Sabbath in the 70s, calling Ozzy a genuine, egoless soul. For a man who has been famous for bravado, the tears stunned fans. It was a brief glimpse into vulnerability, overshadowed but not erased by the firestorms of the year. Even from their earlier positions, these flashpoints are grouped here to reveal the contradiction in Gene Simmons. Loved and hated, popular and resented. He would survive for many decades feeding on the spectacle. But in 2024 and 2025, it was not unusual for that spectacle to spill off stage. And punters were left asking, is he really still in charge of himself? Or has controversy come to master him? That question lingers not only for Simmons, but also for those destined to inherit his empire. Heirs of the Demon's legacy. Life has always been bigger than music. It's been about empire. But as the decades roll on, one question looms. What happens when the demon finally takes off the boots for good? The story of his heirs, his hits, and the shadow of the Kiss brand reveals a legacy equal parts triumph and burden. Gene's children, Nick and Sophie, grew up in the glare of fame, but not always in the glow of approval. Nick, born in 1989, set out to carve his own path as a comic book creator. His 2010 release Incarnate was meant to launch a career, but plagiarism accusations linked its panels directly to the Japanese manga Bleach. The backlash was swift. The publisher pulled the book, and though Nick insisted it was an homage, the scandal stuck. Gene defended his son, but the episode proved the Simmons name carried both privilege and weight. Sophie, born in 1992, chose a different road. Rather than fight the family name, she leaned into it while shaping her own identity. She pursued singing and television, appearing on X Factor, before building a career in body positivity modeling and advocacy. Unlike her father, Sophie spoke openly about insecurities, using vulnerability as a counterpoint to Gene's bravado. In interviews, she often described herself as my father's daughter, but not his reflection, a reminder that living under the Kiss shadow meant navigating, not escaping, it. Then there's Shannon Tweed, Gene's wife since 2011. Though not an heir in the traditional sense, she has long been the stabilizer behind the chaos. Her fiery presence on Gene Simmons' family jewels helped rebrand the rock star as a family man, even as old scandals surfaced. Fans credit her with humanizing him, giving the Simmons empire a personal foundation, not just a financial one. If Simmons has anybody to call his true heir, it is the brand itself. Kiss has, from the start, been much more than a band. It represents a business model, an imprint on the culture that defies definition from lunchboxes to coffins. Over 5,000 licensed products carry that logo, and the band has sold over 100 million albums worldwide. More than $1 billion in sales have been raked in on merchandise alone. Perhaps it is Simmons's proudest boast apart from all those platinum records. Proof that ideas live longer than music. But that empire casts a great shadow. For Nick and Sophie, the challenge has not just been making careers for themselves. It has been to escape comparison to a father who built himself into one of the icons. The brand is, for Gene, both a blessing and a curse. He cannot escape the demon, even in his most vulnerable moments. Each tour, product launch, and business gimmick reinforces that same dichotomy. Gene Simmons, the man, versus Gene Simmons, the mask. The duality seems to be sharper in 2025 than it has ever been. His solo tours falter at the ticket stand, premium ticket packages causing heated debate, and his words set off fires. The logo of KISS, however, remains evergreen, embedded on fans' skin, on T-shirts, and preserved in the pop lexicon. There have been final tours suggested before, yet the machine never really stops. The heir will inherit the wealth and fame, but they still inherit the expectations and mellow glances. To Simmons, this is all very real. It is not a question of what survives him. And so, the story circles back to the man himself. What remains when the fire fades and the mask finally comes off? What's left when the fireworks fade? For half a century, Gene Simmons built his life on spectacle. Fire-breathing shows, blood-spitting theatrics, and a stage presence that promised to outlast time itself. But as the lights dim and the amps go quiet, the unavoidable question remains: what's left when the fireworks fade? Gene's story is full of contradictions. He cast himself as the businessman of rock, proudly sober while others burned out, determined to build an empire where others lost control. He turned shock into strategy and transformed a band into a billion-dollar brand. Yet for all his control, his life has been shaped by scandals, lawsuits, and wounds that no merchandise could hide. His success is undeniable. Few artists reinvented how music and commerce intertwine the way Simmons did. KISS didn't just sell records, they sold an identity. Fans bought into a world, and Gene made sure that the world touched everything from comics to coffins. His legacy, in that sense, is cemented as the man who redefined what it meant to make it in rock and roll. But legacy cuts both ways. For every fan who sees KISS as larger than life, critics point to Simmons as the embodiment of excess, more focused on money than music, more image than authenticity. The branding that made him legendary also made him a lightning rod. In today's culture, where every boast and misstep is preserved online, his claims of thousands of women, his lawsuits, and his reality TV stumbles raise questions. Will he be remembered as a visionary or cautionary tale? But behind the mask hides the boy from Haifa, who lost his father, saw his mother carry the marks of the Holocaust, and promised himself never to feel powerless again. He became the demon, but he also became a husband and father. After long years of turmoil and heartache, Shannon Tweed has remained by his side. Their children, Nick and Sophie, have made their own ways, sometimes stumbling along the journey as they attempt to establish their identities in the shadow of his fame. It is where Gene's legacy has softness, in the family that weathered the chaos with him. What remains when the sparks die? For Gene, perhaps less about fire on the stage now, and more about the one he lit in culture. KISS's makeup and theatrics transformed live performance. Those business instincts have redefined the way bands think about branding. His influence upon our entertainment is undeniable, even if divisive. The true measure may not be in record sales or scandals, but in what outlives him. Will Kiss endure beyond its founders, like Disney or Marvel, or fade into nostalgia? Will Simmons be remembered as the man who conquered with fire and blood, or as someone who couldn't let go of the mask even when the world moved on? As of 2025, Simmons still tours and still courts headlines. The fireworks still spark, but most of them reflect rather than revolutionize. The shock of yesterday is now an accepted part of rock history, and within that history, Simmons will exist, not just as the demon, but also as the man who made it, proved that music could be more than sound. If this breakdown helped you cut through the noise, drop your take in the comments. Marketing genius, line crosser, or both. Hit like, subscribe, and ring the bell so you don't miss our next deep dive. And when you're ready, tap the next video on your screen. We've got more untold stories waiting.